It is almost impossible to spend any significant amount of time on social media without hearing frustrations from both servers and customers alike about tipping and tipping culture. I'm sure you've heard both sides of the debate ad nauseum at this point, but I'll just run down both perspectives for the sake of setting up context. Servers argue that they need tips to be compensated appropriately due to being paid the tipped workers minimum wage of $2.13 an hour, and additionally, being required to tip out other staff in the restaurant. Therefore, poor tippers are essentially costing them money. With this context in mind, the bottom line for servers is that if you can't afford to tip, you can't afford to eat out. Customers, on the other hand, feel frustrated by a dining experience that lacks transparency due to unwritten rules and societal pressures. Counterpoints made by customers typically include that tips are optional, the quality of service affects the tips or the level of tips that they are willing to give, and lastly, they argue that it should be the employer's job to pay their servers and other staff a living wage. Though I cannot pretend to be perfectly objective on this issue, it's honestly hard not to empathize with both sides of this issue. I could not imagine being a server, working hard, doing my best, being woefully underpaid, only to get a $2 tip from a table because I was too busy to get them refills the moment they wanted it. On the other hand, being a hard-working, working-class person who just wants to take their family out for an occasional treat and feeling coerced to pay an additional unspoken tax is also frustrating, especially if I'm being told that I'm a bad person if I don't. The irony here, of course, is that both parties are ultimately frustrated at the same thing: employers refusing to pay their workers a fair and living wage. What they disagree about is how to go about it. Servers think that as long as they are underpaid, customers should tip appropriately, and customers feel that the burden of the wait staff salary should be on the employer and that tips should be nothing more than a courtesy. Similarly, legitimate criticisms can be made of both sides of this. While servers are correct in stating that only servers will be punished if people stop tipping, one can certainly make the argument that it doesn't make sense to fully acknowledge a problem without even attempting to be a part of the solution. Their perspective can certainly come across as, well, yeah, this might suck, but oh well, we can't change anything. Conversely, the idea that everyone should just stop tipping waitstaff can have serious consequences. Somehow, lost in all of this back and forth is the fact that restaurant owners are not being held accountable. And this is because one side wants to hold owners accountable and the other side doesn't. It's not that waiters are incorrectly taking the side of their employers, it's actually a lot more devious than that. Restaurant owners have cleverly managed to align their own interest with those of waitstaff. The truth is, while many servers will cite tipping as necessary because that's how they get paid, there is also a dirty little secret that they aren't admitting to in many cases. Despite the fact that many customers are not generous tippers, the generous tippers more than make up for this deficiency. And the end result is that after cash tips, many servers end up bringing home way more money than they would make at other jobs that they qualify for. This is obvious if you think about it. Servers are paid, in many cases, below the minimum wage, and not everyone tips. So why would they put up with that? The math ultimately works out in their favor under the current system. That's just the truth. Servers understand that if employers were required to pay them at least the federal minimum wage, they would ironically get a pay cut, as customers would then have a much stronger argument against tipping. From the server's perspective, this makes sense. Why would you intentionally embrace a system that would have a net negative outcome for you? This way, servers get paid more and employers don't have to foot the bill. It's a win-win, unless you're the customer, that is. This is where much of the customer frustration ultimately comes from. They are holding up a system that benefits the other party involved, but not them. Aside from having to subconsciously factor in the additional cost of a tip, there's also factors like poor service or substandard food to consider. Feeling obligated to provide a tip after a suboptimal dining experience can feel like an unnecessary moral quandary when you feel like you're the one that deserves to be made whole. So what should we do? Should servers just accept the fact that their take-home pay might decrease if their base pay is increased? Should customers just suck it up and continue to tip? Well, there are a number of potential solutions, but all of them entails one harsh reality: paying more for the dining out experience. Legitimate arguments can be made that the real issue is the entire model of dining out. Restaurants typically operate on fairly thin margins relative to other industries, and customers may just have to adjust to the reality of paying more for the dining out experience if it means a fair wage for servers. And that may make some say, if we're going to pay more no matter what, why not just keep the current system? Another fair question to be sure, but the answer is transparency. Customers should be able to enjoy a dining experience knowing that all the staff are being fairly compensated and that the stated price is the stated price and not a penny of expectation more. An additional but lesser discussed aspect of the tipping arrangement is the fact that customers, even well-meaning ones, determine the salary of servers. And even if every single customer did their best to tip fairly, this would still be problematic. As someone who has personally held several different white-collar jobs, my take-home pay has never depended on my daily output, which, to be clear, will vary. The idea that someone's livelihood should be dependent largely on the kindness of strangers is incredibly problematic. And that's without even getting into the racist history of tipping in the first place. One potential compromise and solution is that customers boycott restaurants until waitstaff are fairly compensated, abolish the tipped minimum wage, and pay servers a living wage, not the federal minimum wage, but an actual living wage. Restaurant owners will then raise their prices accordingly, but those prices will be real and, more importantly, ethical prices. The obvious problem with this solution is that it still harms servers in the short run. A boycott will not immediately yield the desired results, but rather restaurant owners will cut staff as a result. Another less elegant solution is changing the objectively irrational tipping norm from one based on time spent in the restaurant to a lower but more manageable percentage. A mandatory 10% for every customer as opposed to the inspirational 20%. Still far from an ideal solution, it just repackages the problem as opposed to directly rectifying it. The uncomfortable truth underneath it all is that servers, though they are themselves being exploited by their employers, have also accidentally found themselves in a predicament that almost makes them class traders. They get to earn a living wage, or close to it, without burdening their employers. And to challenge this setup will cost them in the short run. Servers ideally should be joining other working class people in the fight for living wages. But why would they abandon a relatively comfortable present for a future that isn't guaranteed? And as you may have figured out by now, this was never about servers versus customers. It's about how capitalism is sustained by the owner class exploiting the worker class, and continuing that exploitation by turning the working class on each other. Customers are told to tip or stay home. Servers are told to get a better job, but employers aren't forced to pay their workers better. The cycle continues, and the material conditions of the worker is not improved. Servers shouldn't feel obligated to support tipped minimum wage. They only do this because they know they will be offered the federal minimum wage as a response. Servers do important work and should be paid fairly and not according to the whims of customer biases. Customer biases that include tipping more to attractive servers or servers that are perceived as being more flirtatious. The lack of a clean and obvious solution that immediately satisfies all parties involved shouldn't stop us from pursuing one. I do not pretend to have the answers, but I will say for me personally, I just avoid situations where tipping is the norm. I no longer visit sit-down restaurants, and I no longer have food delivered to my house. But this solution, if you can even call it that, is not necessarily for everyone, and that's fine. And to be clear, although I am not, nor have I ever been a server, the larger issue is server pay. Yes, it is annoying as a customer to have to deal with tipping culture, but that's more of an inconvenience as far as I'm concerned. The fact that employers can pay servers below poverty wages is a serious problem, especially since not all servers earn enough from tips to comfortably make ends meet. Yes, some servers do make a fairly comfortable living for themselves with tips, but it's important to remember that this is not representative of everyone in that field. I haven't even touched on the social aspects of tipping, specifically the weird power dynamics that develop. I'm not proud of this, but I refused to tip exactly one time in my life. The waitress seemed dismissive, inattentive, and slow, as well as just straight up refusing to bring a drink that I ordered to the table, despite the fact that I could see it from where I was sitting. I think many people would feel justified not tipping in that situation. And if we're being honest, there is something satisfying and cathartic about having the power to do something about the feeling that we've been given poor service. This strange dynamic brings out the worst in some customers. Rather than just enjoying their dining experience, there are people who basically spend their time in restaurants nitpicking every word and action from the person waiting on them so they can ultimately feel powerful while deciding what points they will award and deduct before deciding on the server's final tip. And this ugly dynamic, though mostly one-sided, can flow in the opposite direction as well. Servers can and do sometimes have their own biases about which customers will and will not tip well, resulting in an odd vicious cycle where a customer receives suboptimal service due to the perception that they will not tip well, and due to receiving suboptimal service, surprise, they don't tip well. I can speak from personal experience, having an overwhelming desire to tip extremely well for years because I wanted to prove to the waiter or waitress that black people tip well, a stereotype that has always annoyed me. But I eventually realized that someone who genuinely believed that would not be convinced otherwise anyway. Stereotypes and generalizations aside, I think that we can all likely agree on is that the social media bickering between servers and customers is not solving anything. At the end of the day, we all mostly have one thing in common. We are members of the working class who are being exploited in different ways. So while some servers may technically be turning their backs on the working class in favor of self-interest, I cannot fully fault them. And while some customers may be fed up with tipping and engaging in poor tipping behaviors as a result, I likewise cannot fully blame them. Don't mistake this as me as both sizing this issue. However, I think ultimately that servers are ultimately the bigger victims of the system here. What does need to happen though is servers and customers coming together and applying the heat where it applies, at the feet of restaurant owners. Now, I may have let it slip a couple times in the video that I am a software engineer, and I'm bringing it up now for a very specific purpose. I do want to introduce you to CandorCloud.com. It is a cloud storage web app that I built myself from scratch and still working on. And the reason I am mentioning it is because rather than push a Patreon where I feel the need to come up with creative incentives and rewards for my patrons, I decided I would rather provide you direct value. So if you would like to support this channel and help it grow, please go to CandorCloud.com If you want, you can just check it out by starting with the free tier, 10 gigabytes for free, 100% free. We also have monthly, annual, and lifetime plans where you can just make one purchase and you have the storage for the lifetime of the service or your lifetime, whichever ends first. And it is a great way to support this channel. And like I said, new features are still being worked on. Currently in the paid tiers, there's a music player, a video player, and client-side zero knowledge encryption. So please check it out, and there'll be more to come. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share with your friends.